The fatherhood of Chesterton may seem a marginal subject for a conference on the theme of Chesterton and woman, but I think it goes to the heart of Chesterton's understanding of woman. In sharp comparison with our cultural championing of atomised individuals, marooned, we might say, in their own moment of time, Chesterton had a different vision. He cherished the human person not as isolated, but as an integral part of history and community. He saw the ordinary man as fulfilled rather than frustrated by the bonds of marriage and family. This is the context in which I'd like to explore Chesterton's conception of fatherhood. His own experience of fatherhood, as for most people, began in his childhood home. He was brought up in a solidly middle-class family in late 19th century London. His great-grandfather had founded a real estate firm called Chesterton's, which still exists and is now an international chain. His father, Edward Chesterton, worked in the family business. But Chesterton did not inherit from his father any mercantile or professional skills. He drew rather on his father's intellectual resources, which were abundant, particularly his gifts of literary and artistic imagination. Chesterton was inspired by his father as an amateur, as it were, rather than a professional. Edward Chesterton was a man of many hobbies. The one that left an indelible impression on the young Gilbert's imagination was that of a toy theatre. In his autobiography, Chesterton recalls that his first childhood memory was of a scene in his father's toy theatre. The scene was of a young man crossing a bridge which was set amid mountains in the shadow of a high castle tower. In Chesterton's early imagination, this scene crystallised his experience of boyhood. It conveyed such authenticity that it formed the background of his developing thought. He saw it, he said, and I quote, as a sort of symbol of all that I happen to like in imagery and ideas. This early impression remained vivid throughout Chesterton's life. It glowed in his memory, as he put it, like a glimpse of some incredible paradise. Well, if the toy theatre stimulated his imagination, it also helped to mould his mind. In what ways did it do this? The detail of the theatre's design gave Chesterton an early sense of definition and differentiation. As he said, looking through a square hole at yellow pasteboard alerted him to the importance of edges and frames and limits. The experience made clear to him what he called the boundary line that brings one thing sharply against another. And so they helped to form his basic understanding of life. They were, he said, I quote, the fragmentary suggestions of a philosophy I have since found to be the truth. Now, in an essay that he wrote on the toy theatre, Chesterton recognised in one of his earliest paradoxes that the main principle of art was not expansion. Rather, it was limitation. This idea influenced his writing on virtually every subject throughout his life, not only art, but also literature and politics and religion. It gave his developing mind a natural basis for the understanding of higher truths and principles. All the essential morals, he said, which modern men need to learn, could be deduced from this toy theatre. Chesterton believed that by reducing the scale of things, there was now a concentrated space in which great and far-reaching ideas could be dramatised. The small, as it were, was a theatre for capturing the large. Maisie Ward, Chesterton's first biographer, suggests that his father meant more to Chesterton than his mother, fond as he was of her. His influence on his son was a decisive but uncommon blend of imagination and reason. Chesterton's father had a powerful visual imagination and a disciplined mind, and these formed the foundation of Chesterton's intellectual outlook as an adult. And yet, for all the happiness of his childhood, Chesterton was nonetheless aware of the limitations of his family upbringing. The Victorian era was renowned for its moral code, but the creed, the belief system which underpinned it, the beliefs that inspired and guided behaviour, had faded. Chesterton thought, in fact, that this late 19th century period presented, as he put it, almost the first irreligious home in all human history. In a letter at the time of his later conversion to Catholicism, he wrote, "My father is the very best man I ever knew of that generation that never understood the new need of a spiritual authority, and lives almost perfectly by the sort of religion men had when rationalism was rational." Now, the ultimate human impulses, of course, go beyond reason, not to circumscribe or deny it, but to recognise the truth of Pascal's realisation that an infinitude of things lie beyond reason. As Australia's honorary poet laureate, Les Murray, once put it, the answer is not in the same world as the question. In a biological sense, Chesterton was not a father, a terribly sad deprivation for him and his wife Frances. But did the vocation of fatherhood find other outlets? I believe it did, in several forms. One was as a neighbourhood father for the children of Beaconsfield, the small town outside of London where Chesterton lived. A second was his adoption of a long-serving secretary, Dorothy Collins, as the daughter he and Frances never had. And a third was in the form of a spiritual fatherhood through his creation of the priest-detective Father Brown. Let me expand briefly on each of these in turn. After moving from London to Beaconsfield in 1909, Gilbert and Frances became part of the community of the town. They developed a strong affinity with the families there, and in particular the children. At various times they hosted gatherings at their home. The Christmas party was always a special event. It was only for children, no adults were invited, and the children would be entertained by games that the couple would devise, as well as by Gilbert's toy theatre, which he would dramatise by painting figures and scenery and devising plots for plays. A more lasting connection was the appointment of Dorothy Collins as Chesterton's secretary. She served faithfully in this role for the last 10 years of his life, not only bringing organisational order to his life, but also becoming a close family member. Chesterton dedicated his biography of Thomas Aquinas to her, stating that, I quote, "Without your help, the author would have been more than usually helpless." Dorothy Collins also played a crucial part in the years after Chesterton's death in being his literary executor. She served as the custodian of his voluminous writings, not only archivally, but also managing endless copyright issues and compiling new collections of his works. Now, there was a third dimension of Chesterton's appreciation of fatherhood that I'd like to highlight, and that was his creation of Father Brown. The character of this priest detective has often been analysed in terms of his psychological and even spiritual approach to the criminal. He could understand the criminal as a human being prone to the same weaknesses as he himself as a priest. He also had the advantage of the confessional as a means of penetrating the deepest flaws of human behaviour. By comparison, Sherlock Holmes belonged to the school of conventional detection, which analysed the clues left at the scene of the crime. But Chesterton's creation of Father Brown had another aspect, in that he not only solved a crime, he also opened up a higher solution. As a priest, he was inspired by a more ultimate purpose than simply solving a crime, important though that was in the quest for justice. He finally wanted the criminal, and Chesterton wanted us as readers of the Father Brown detective stories to absorb a fresh insight into the truth and meaning of his earthly existence, and as a result, for the criminal to change his life. This happened with the master criminal Flambeau, who appeared in so many of the Father Brown stories, and who finally reformed and became a detective himself. Thus, Chesterton saw fatherhood as both a natural and a supernatural condition. It was a natural basis of marriage and family and community life, and it was a supernatural source of inspiration and pathway to salvation. His insights have much to say, I think, to our own society at this time, when the effects of fatherlessness have reached such damaging proportions in the spread of poverty, the drop in educational performance among children, the growth of drug abuse, the confusion over sexual identity, and the worrying levels of physical and particularly mental health. Let me now consider another dimension of insight, and that is to search for the connection between fatherhood and manhood, and consider how dependent on fatherhood is a healthy understanding of manhood. Prior to the sexual revolution of the 1960s, boys and girls saw manhood as a pinnacle of character formation. Becoming and being a man was a strong social expectation, manifested in such qualities as courage and endurance and loyalty, especially to home and family. Thus, manhood was a fundamental condition of successful fatherhood. Chesterton saw in it as well a higher meaning in the context of man's original sin in the Garden of Eden. We speak, he noted, of a manly man, but not of a whaley whale or any other animal. And this difference in language, Chesterton thought, reflected the higher nature and destiny of human beings by comparison with animals. As he put it, if you wanted to dissuade a man from drinking his 10th whiskey, you would slap him on the back and say, "Be a man." No one who wished to dissuade a crocodile from eating his 10th explorer would slap it on the back and say, "Be a crocodile." For we have no notion of a perfect crocodile, no allegory of a whale expelled from his whaley Eden. Now, the responsibilities of manhood were also expressed in another way in our culture, in the ancient virtue of chivalry. This practice of courtesy between the sexes might now be dismissed as patronising to women, but it was founded on respect, the respect a man owed to a woman, based on her exalted status as a creature of God, as personified in Mary, the Mother of God. It was a sign of the consideration she commanded from men, not a lame concession to her weakness. As the meaning of sex has unravelled in the past half-century, our culture now tends to equate manhood with toxic masculinity. But the valuing of manhood in such terms can only be counterproductive. It finally undermines fatherhood and is bound to license men to engage in ever greater avoidance of responsibility, unrestrained by the obligations of chivalry. It produces weak men whom women cannot and will not respect or be able to rely on. Writing on the kinds of books that appeal to boys, Chesterton singled out the love of adventure. Here again, however, contemporary culture is no longer cultivating this boyhood trait. As a fellow speaker at our conference on Chesterton and Woman, Francis Cantrell has commented, and I quote, "I do fear," Francis has said, "that rather than championing a boy's zest for adventure, we have numbed and sedated this great desire. Instead of adventures that test their limits, we sedate them with video games. Instead of risk to pursue relationships, we offer pornography, which in my humble opinion is a contributing factor of the pandemic of lost boys instead of the men they were created to be. Although these desires may be in comatose state for many, they're not erased." Well, how might Chesterton have responded to these profound changes to how boys are raised and the impact of this on fatherhood? Our insight into his marriage with Frances and his relationship with so many children would suggest a couple of thoughts. One is that he appreciated the strengths of his wife while being ready to respond to her weaknesses. In the way that any married couple complement one another, Chesterton relied on his wife for enormous practical support in so many ways. But in turn, he extended psychological and spiritual strength to her during the various bouts of depression that she experienced. The second thought is that Chesterton saw fatherhood as not simply biological, but relational. It's clearly biological in the sense of a man fathering a child with a woman, but it is not dependent on this. Like St. Joseph's foster relationship with Christ, Chesterton understood that he could still exercise the vocation of fatherhood in an extended way and more broadly into the surrounding culture. Let me finally explore the wider dimensions of Chesterton's understanding of fatherhood in the context of the nature of woman, without which fatherhood would not exist. This is a formidably difficult subject to address in present-day culture, pervaded as it is not only by the assumptions of secular feminism, but now as a contradictory force, the assertion of sexual identity as being subjective, no longer fixed, but fluid, no longer governed by biology, but by social pressures and psychological impulses. Chesterton had, by today's standards, a romantic view of womanhood, or more accurately, perhaps, two uplifting beliefs in womanhood: its natural power of procreation and its supernatural power of spiritual intercession. In the first case, procreation, Chesterton celebrated the value of woman as the channel of new life, felt even more poignantly in his case, of course, because he and Frances could not have children. And in the second case of spiritual intercession, he had a special devotion to Mary as the Mother of God, as a unique channel of divine life. She gathered up, as he put it, all those elements of the heart and the higher instincts which are the legitimate shortcuts to the love of God. At one stage, Chesterton was looking for an image of Mary to give to the new church in Beaconsfield. He visited a shop in London and accompanied the proprietor to a storeroom. And there he found an appealing statue, as he put it, amid planks and shavings and sawdust, just as she stood in the carpenter's shop in Nazareth. It brought to his mind a legendary story about Mary that he'd once heard in the Irish county of Donegal. This was the story of someone meeting, amid the rocky wastes, a beautiful peasant woman carrying a child. When asked her name, she answered simply, "I am the Mother of God, and this is Himself, and He is the boy you will all be wanting at the last." Now, if we compare this vision of womanly goodness and grace to the picture we face in present-day culture in the wake of the sexual revolution, we see immediately that the contrasts are sharp and painful. They are about lust rather than love, about making use of other human beings rather than cherishing them, and about prizing immediate pleasure above long-term fulfilment. We see, for example, that the sexual revolution was not just about separating sex from children, with the invention of the pill and the rise of a contraceptive and IVF culture. It was finally about separating sex from love. The pornography, now pervasive, is a celebration not of beauty or emotion or intimacy. It's fundamentally a denial of love. It is sex in the marketplace, where price matters more than value. It's a mechanistic substitute for what should be organic and nurturing. It's fueled by the delusion that indulgence is better than devotion and that pleasure can replace tenderness. The latest manifestation of sexual confusion, transgenderism, goes even further. It's not just a denial of sexual distinctiveness, but even more a denial of human nature itself. A perverse parallel, I think, has occurred in the intellectual and existential spheres of our culture, the spheres of our minds and our lived experience. In the realm of the intellect, there has been a divorce between the natural understandings of reason and the spiritual revelations of faith. In the realm of experience, there's been a divorce between the motives and the meanings of sex and its fruits. Well, what have been the results? The separation of reason from faith is finally causing a destruction of reason through the triumph of subjective feeling over objective reality. And the separation of sex from its procreative and relational fruits is finally leading not just to a childless society, but to a loveless society as well. In both cases, Chesterton offered early prophecies, and I'll finish with these statements, both made more than a century ago. The first prophecy spells out what the loss of reason would mean, and the other two comments ponder the effects of sex when it's governed by lust instead of love. Well, firstly, Chesterton's comment on reason. He said, "The great march of mental destruction will go on. Everything will be denied, everything will become a creed. It is a reasonable position to deny the stones in the street. It will be a religious dogma to assert them. It's a rational thesis that we are all in a dream. It'll be a mystical sanity to say that we are all awake. Fires will be kindled to testify that 2 and 2 make 4. Swords will be drawn to prove that leaves are green in summer. We shall be left defending not only the incredible virtues and sanities of human life, but something more incredible still. This huge, impossible universe which stares us in the face. We shall fight for visible prodigies as if they were invisible. We shall look on the impossible grass and the skies with a strange courage. We shall be of those who have seen and yet have believed. And now 2 final statements of Chesterton's on sex. The first one: the next great heresy is going to be simply an attack on morality, and especially on sexual morality. The roots of the new heresy, God knows, are as deep as nature itself, whose flower is the lust of the flesh and the lust of the eye and the pride of life. I say that the man who cannot see this cannot see the signs of the times, cannot see even the sky signs in the street that are the new sort of signs in heaven. The madness of tomorrow is not in Moscow, but much more in Manhattan. But most of what was in Broadway is already in Piccadilly. And the second and final quote of Chesterton's on the abuse of sex, and he wrote, "The appeal to animal appetite may succeed by its very familiarity. Indecency is not wild and lawless. The danger of indecency is exactly that it is tame, dull, direct, inevitable, a mere law in the members. It is automatic evil. Pride makes a man a devil, but lust makes him a machine." Thank you very much.